That our 3 years of work on the opioid stewardship bill has been for naught. I would like to thank the Governor Dayton and his staff and his entire administration for all their help and support with data, advice, and assistance. And it was a special call out to the Pharmacy Board and Cody Weiberg, who he and his members did a lot of calculations for the first two versions of the bill and worked very hard. And many of the members of MDH and DHS and the Department of Commerce, the Department of Revenue. I can't mention all of you, but thank you. Senator Julie Rosen was our champion in the Senate. She fought through this bill. She kept it clean. It was, the funds would come from the pharmaceutical companies and the distributors, and we managed to pass it 60-6, in large part to her work with the Republicans in the caucus. So I'd also like to thank Lexi Reed Holtom and the Steve Rumler Hope Network and all of their all their members, their board, their families, and who lost loved ones, who they called, they emailed, they came here personally on their own time, and they really worked hard to get this legislation through. In the House, our author, Dave Baker, was not able to get the legislation through without general fund money. And the Republican leadership in the House just refused to help with the legislation, and in fact, Speaker Doubt lied several times about allowing it to travel independently, and ended up jamming it into the what they're calling the Omnibus Prime Bill, which had about 989 pages, and so with a lot of bad legislation. And I have contacted the governor and encouraged him to veto the bill. The taxpayers have paid enough. We don't need taxpayer funds to pay to remedy this situation. The pharmaceutical companies caused this epidemic. They knew these drugs were addictive. They intentionally sent them out there to be sold, to make billions of dollars on them, to addict our family members, and knowing that they could overdose and die. As far as I'm concerned, they killed them, and I am angry. In the end, Big Pharma, their army of lobbyists, and the Chamber and Medical Alley won. The victims, their families, the people currently addicted, and the Minnesota taxpayers lost. And I'm angry and sad. I will turn it over to Lexi Reed Holtom, the Executive Director of the Steve Rumler Hope Network.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your time again today. It is just such a disappointment that we're here before you without a standalone bill that moved through the body of the House. We're incredibly proud of the work that Senator Eaton, Senator Rosen, and frankly, most of the members of the Senate put forth in moving a piece of legislation that would have created $20 million in brand new revenue for our state to address the soaring costs of the opioid crisis. We know for a fact, statistically, out of the CDC, they have stated that 4 out of 5 new heroin users started with prescription pain pills. This is an epidemic that was started and caused and continues to thrive because of opioid pharmaceuticals. This is not a heroin crisis. This is a prescription pill crisis that is fueling, this is a prescription pill epidemic crisis that's fueling a heroin epidemic. We started working on this legislation with Opioid Day on the Hill this year. As Senator Eaton already told you, we worked on this bill for the last 3 years. But Opioid Day on the Hill was March 1st in the House. We, at that point, got stalled out in the House. For Speaker Doubt to state that our governor is not doing his job by coming forth with supporting this last-minute omnibus bill that he's put together is a lie. All along, from the get-go, he made promises to us that he was going to move our bill as a standalone bill, and he reneged on that promise. And to say that he is protecting taxpayers from increased taxes is also a lie. The bulk of the money that is supporting solutions for the opioid crisis comes from individual taxpayers' money. What we were asking for was to have pharma have skin in the game in creating the solutions to this crisis that they caused. So again, I want to thank the Senate passing this same version that we proposed in the House 60-6. How can there be such a deep divide between the Republicans in the Senate who did the good work of actually taking a stand against special interests and the House? So that is a question that I hope that constituents across our great state ask their representatives this coming summer. We certainly will be sharing the facts of who voted which way, so that everybody has good information. What happened in the House this year was that taxpayers are now going to have to continue to fund the solutions to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Lexi. Thank you all for being here. My name is Dr. Chris Johnson. I serve on the board of the Steve Rumler Hope Network. I also work with the Department of Human Services Opioid Prescribing Work Group. And I'm sorry to have to address you in this circumstance here today. I began working on the crisis of the opioid epidemic when I was still practicing full-time in the emergency department back in 2004. So I've been doing this well over a decade. And there comes as I progressed in my advocacy around this problem, I had proceeded with the idea that we were really all on the same team, and it was just a matter of getting everyone on the same page, making sure the knowledge was out there to get solutions done. And that I first approached my profession and explained to them, here's what the data says on the overdoses, where's the evidence that it really helps. And while there was some pleasant acknowledgement, there really wasn't much movement in terms of we need to talk, everyone needs to get on the same page from the medicine standpoint and stop this. And as I progressed along in my advocacy, and this past Sunday, you reach that terrible moment when you realize we're not on the same page, and they don't have any intention to be on the same page. The reason a problem like this could proceed is because people are doing very well financially without changing a thing. That is why the data can be so bad and nothing happens, because it is highly lucrative for segments of the medical industry, pharma in particular. The actions of the House Republicans here, and Kurt Dowd in particular, reveal that they are on the side of the pharmaceutical industry whose only goal is to maximize revenue, and if that means the lives and the health of Minnesotans are forfeit, that they're forfeit as long as they're not accountable, and so far they haven't been. No one's held them accountable. And so I'm angry about that. And I want to make sure everyone understands that this was a hostile act you saw. This was a hostile act in the legislature. People tend to think that if it's not rioting and bricks through windows, pitchforks and torches, that, you know, that's what hostility is. No, no, no. Hostility is in a line of text in a bill. That costs lives. For example, we all heard of that story just recently of that 26-year-old who aged out of his parents' insurance and couldn't afford his insulin because the price had tripled in the last 10 years, and he was no longer able to pay for it. It's $2,000 a month. He's 26 years old. So he rationed it. His name was Patrick Boyle. I think that was his name. Shane Boyle. He aged out of his parents' insurance, couldn't afford his insulin, started a GoFundMe page, came up $50 short, and died of diabetic ketoacidosis. He is just as dead as if a mob broke into his house and beat him with a baseball bat. But it was done through financial violence. legally restricting the ability of patients to get drugs at a reasonable price, a constructed monopolistic marketplace where the patients are held hostage. This occurs in medicine all the time. Insulin's been around since the 1920s. This should have been an inexpensive drug. But because of the legal actions to restrict the marketplace, patients are put at risk. And so what we saw here today, where the House Republicans decided that for the cost of this crisis, both in terms of lives lost and expenses to the taxpayers, they were perfectly happy to have the taxpayer, the constituents pay for it, the patients and their families pay for it, rather than the industry that caused it in the first place. And so I'm angry and upset. Finally, I'll say this as a physician, that you know, it might seem odd that I get upset about funding mechanisms and the economics of this and the legislation, and that I should just, you know, go see the patient in the clinic. You see them for 15 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever, and you move on, and that's your job. Actually, that's not what I swore an oath to do. The oath I swore back in, I think I had my coat ceremony in 1996, stated specifically that I am taught and I have to be aware of the impact that an illness might have on their family and on a patient's economic stability. And I am tasked, as part of my physician oath, that I have to remember that economic stability as I treat my patient and act on their behalf. I would say the entire medical industry is grossly negligent of that in this country. And that is why I'm speaking up today, why I'm speaking up for the opioid crisis, and that what we saw here was almost predatory. And we need desperate political change to bring about a safer, more effective healthcare system for the patients of Minnesota and for the country. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Shelley Elkington. In 1995, my daughter Casey Jo was 7 years old. She was in the 2nd grade, riding her bike, playing in the playhouse in our backyard and riding her bike down the street to the store to get candy. In 1995, Purdue Pharmaceutical introduced OxyContin, a slow-release opioid, and they aggressively marketed it. In 2007, Casey graduates from high school after a stellar senior year. She placed 6th at the state swim meet. She's off to study biology and radiology at NDSU, and her life is starting to look pretty fantastic. I was excited to start a life with my adult daughter. Also in 2007, the federal government brings criminal charges against Purdue Pharmaceutical for misleading and defrauding physicians and consumers. They paid $634 million in fines and criminal fees. 3 executives are sentenced, but they continue to aggressively market this product. 2015. After nearly 2 years of prescription drugs for her Crohn's disease, OxyContin included, oxycodone, fentanyl, we get a call that our beautiful and spirited daughter's body was found in the back of her garage. She was 26 years old. Also in 2015, the DEA announced it's arrested 280 people, including 22 doctors and pharmacists, for the largest prescription drug bust in the history of the DEA in America. So, if we cannot make the connection that these companies have systematically murdered our children, our brothers and sisters, our parents, then we're sure not following the giant breadcrumbs very well. Lawmakers are here in these buildings to see that we are safe, to see that industries are not taking advantage of citizens and that they are stopped. It is their responsibility. It's why we elected them, and they failed me. They failed Casey. And most of all, they failed the families that are going to experience the horrific loss we are. They were unable to stand up against Big Pharma and what those billions of dollars could offer them. I'm sickened by this. I'm angry. I'll tell you, back in February, I was in a meeting with Speaker Doubt, and he shook his fingers at those pharma lobbyists, and he said, mark my words, this is going to happen. You tell your clients to get their checkbooks out because we're going to do something here in Minnesota. We had Joe Ranasisi from the DEA, a top cop from Washington, D.C., come here, as if we needed him to prove this, but he did, a whistleblower, come and tell you about the systematic corruption going on in the prescription drug industry. And then the pharma lobbyists went to work. They went to work with their magic and their money. So here's what I'll leave the lawmakers here with. We watched. I was here a couple times a week. I drove in from Montevideo, 2.5 hours away. I left my family, my grieving family, my job, to come down here and advocate for what was right, and it wasn't enough, because I don't wear a suit, and I don't get paid by lobbyists, and I learned that citizen lobbyists don't matter. We were made fun of. We were ignored. We were called names. Citizen lobbyists have to have a place in our legislature. We have to. So I'm here to make sure that that continues to happen. I was looking through some documents, and I was looking back. In 1991, the Minnesota legislature enacted the cold weather rule because people were freezing to death, because energy companies were price gouging in the winter, and people couldn't pay their bills, and they froze to death. So guess what happened? The legislature came in and said, no more. You can't do that. And it saved people's lives. And you know what happened? All the energy companies still made money. They didn't go broke. Their shareholders and their owners still made plenty of money, and Big Pharma would have continued to make money too. Nobody was going to suffer here. Everything would have worked. So we needed heroes. We had some. We had Senator Eaton and Senator Rosen, and if you go back and you watch some of the committee hearings in the Senate, it was some of the most inspiring political hours I've ever seen in my life. So we had heroes, but instead, we also got a lot of bullies and bad guys. These lobbyists were slick. I thought I could trust them. I believed in this process. I was told we could go through in a trustworthy system. I didn't think they'd let us down, but they did. But most of all, I'm sorry. I get messages from families all the time. And it's what got me here every week. I would come back every week because I would get messages saying that somebody's child had died. And I feel like I let them down. Like I didn't try hard enough. But it was so hard. It was so hard walking down those hallways and seeing what we were up against. So to all the families, I'm sorry. I'm ashamed of the process, and I hope someday we can make it right.
I can add to that. We're open for questions if you have any.
Ms. Ellington, can you outline, you say Kirk Dowd shook his finger at the pharma lobbyists and said, get out your checkbooks. I think I'm paraphrasing it correctly. What happened between then and the work product, or your judgment, lack thereof, of this legislative session? And what role did Speaker Dowd have in that your judgment?
I'd encourage you all to ask him. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew. I can only speculate what happened between then and there. My guess is the lobbyist, changed his mind. I talked to him actually last Tuesday in the hallway up here as he was coming out of the session, and he told me it wasn't his responsibility to hold pharmaceutical companies accountable. He felt that it was punishing them, and that he didn't feel that many people were misusing opioids. So those are his words.
Senator Eaton, where do you go from here with the veto? Where do you go from here without a veto?
With the veto or without it, the language that's in the omnibus bill essentially gives $1 million, and 600 of it is appropriated somewhere else, 600,000. So, it's pretty meaningless. If it would pass, I would try and build on it and get some pharmaceutical money in there, but I don't expect it to. The governor has assured me he's going to veto it. With the veto, we look at what happens in this next election. If Speaker Dowd is still there, I'll probably go to the courts. If the House is able to, the Democrats are able to take the House back, we'll probably try again with the legislation. I believe that he was the main impediment. I believe that from what I talked to with Representative Baker, our House author, that he was the one, and the other leadership, Republican leadership there, are the ones who have refused to allow him to progress the bill the way he wanted. And we need to change that leadership before we take this bill forward in legislation.
Senator, you made reference to going to court. Elaborate on that a little bit. Meaning Speaker Dowd is still in office, is that what you're saying?
Well, at this moment, the only thought I have is to meet with the Attorney General, Lori Swanson, and ask her to sue on behalf of the state of Minnesota. Many states have done that. If
Two pharmaceutical companies?
Right.
Okay, as some counties, as attorneys have done.
Right, and many states have done that. I know one state just got $40 million, and it's one avenue. I liked the legislative avenue better because you could structure how the money was used. We had an advisory council that could direct the money to developing a system for addiction within the state. And I'm not always confident to how that kind of money will get spent if it's suddenly given to the Department of Human Services. I suspect there's a lot of needs that it might get siphoned off into.
Can you remind us from when the session began and penny a pill to what you were looking for, what the total dollar amounts would be, and then as they cascaded down throughout the session and what you ended up with before you got to finally $1 million?
Well, we started out with the penny a pill version and went to the morphine milligram equivalent version, and then went to a multiplier with that version, which ended up being like 15 cents a pill for like OxyContin. And then we went to the licensure fee from the pharmaceutical companies and the distributors. And the first few versions were 11 to 17 million, something like that. And when we went to the licensure fee, including the distributors, we had 20 million that they, depending on the percentage of business they did in the state, would be responsible for. So if they did 10% of the business in the state, they would be responsible for 10% of 20 million. So the top number we ever asked for was 20 million. And as you said, we're down to $1 million. That essentially leaves $400,000 for opioids.
Obviously, there was a lot of politics that went on here, but can you remind us of what the human impact of not having $20 million a year for funding might be?
Well, there won't be as much money for the grants for naloxone. We did save 2,000 lives last year with naloxone, primarily due to Steve's Law, which in great part the Steve Remler Hope Network helped with. And so all first responders and individuals can carry naloxone. And there won't be money to develop a treatment system. You know, if you go to the hospital and you have a heart attack or stroke, there's a plan of care. There's a process that they follow with every single one of them. There's a medical plan of care. We don't have that for addiction. People who are overdosing go to the ER, they bring them back with the naloxone, and they send them out the door in full-blown withdrawal, sometimes giving them a naloxone kit. So when they do it again, they might survive. I mean, that's our plan of care right now. That's not acceptable. That's barbaric.
I want to add one more thing to that. Besides just the dollar figure, accountability is not just some retrospective, achieve some sort of emotionally satisfying justice. Accountability is about your safety going forward. As a physician, I'm not allowed to harm a patient, even if I do everything technically with all the proper data. If there's a bad outcome, or even if I took out the wrong kidney or did something, I'm asked to be accountable. Not just to make it up to that patient, but to make sure that we put in process to make patients safer in the future. And what has happened here is that there's been no accountability to the industry, and so they have no incentive to test treatments properly before they expose the patient population in the future. So the 20 million or whatever dollar figured amount is not just about trying to compensate those who have been already damaged. It's also about sending a message that you need to properly scientifically vet your proposed treatment, whether it's the pharmaceutical or device industry or even other medical professionals. Properly vet it, properly test it, and prove it before you expose the greater patient population as a whole to harm. And by not doing that, you've all been put at risk. Your family's been put at risk. Everyone's been put at risk. That there is no consequence. It hasn't been tested very well, but it's lucrative. Go forward, see what happens. That's not safe.
And what has happened is 65,000 Americans have died, more than in Vietnam. I mean, this is outrageous. Any other questions?
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.